The night shift at St. Jude's is less about medical miracles and more about surviving the oppressive, heavy silence that settles over the wards once the sun dips below the horizon and the city outside turns into a blur of distant headlights. You get used to the sounds after a while, the rhythmic wheeze of the ventilators, and the occasional frantic squeak of rubber soles on freshly waxed linoleum. But there is a specific type of quiet that only exists in the older wings of the building. I've been a night nurse here for 6 years, and I've learned to navigate the hallways by the flickering of the overhead fluorescents, which always seem to be on the verge of a collective nervous breakdown. My station is positioned right at the junction of the 400 wing, a section of the hospital that was mostly closed off in the late 90s because the plumbing was failing and the wiring wasn't up to code for modern diagnostic equipment. There are only a handful of rooms there that we use for overflow or long-term storage, but room 402 is supposed to be completely empty, its heavy wooden door usually locked tight to keep the wandering geriatric patients from getting lost in the dark. It was around 2:15 in the morning when the call light on my console first flickered to life. A small, stubborn amber square that sent a jolt of caffeine-fueled anxiety straight to my chest. I stared at the number 402 for a long time, my brain trying to rationalize a mechanical glitch or perhaps a short in the aging circuitry of the nurse call system. I remember looking down the long, dim corridor toward that wing, where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink against the baseboards, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. According to the records I'd seen during my orientation, the last patient assigned to 402 was a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had passed away in that very bed in 1984. Yet here was her call button screaming for attention. I didn't want to go down there alone, but the policy is strict about responding to every alert, and the persistent chime was beginning to echo through the empty nurses' station like a heartbeat. I grabbed my flashlight and a set of master keys, my palms sweating against the cold metal as I began the long walk down the hallway where the air always feels 5 degrees colder than the rest of the floor. The carpeted runners in the 400 wing are worn thin, muffled by decades of footsteps, and my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the narrow space. When I reached the door to 402, I noticed that the red light above the frame was pulsing with a rhythmic intensity, casting a sickly crimson glow over the peeling wallpaper. I took a deep breath, telling myself that it was probably just a heavy equipment cart that had shifted in the storage room and bumped the bedside remote, and I turned the key in the lock. The door groaned on its hinges, revealing a room that was thick with the smell of stagnant air, old dust, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like the scent of dried blood or rusted pipes. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a stack of folded wheelchairs in the corner and several boxes of expired Roman IV starts piled high against the far wall. The bed was still there, a skeletal frame of rusted iron with a thin, plastic-wrapped mattress that looked like it hadn't been touched in 30 years. My eyes darted to the call button, which was dangling from the side rail by a frayed gray cord, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw that the plastic casing was depressed, held down by something I couldn't quite see. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and I reached out to reset the button, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, grimy plastic. As soon as I clicked it off, the room plunged into an even deeper silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums until they might burst. I turned to leave, convinced that I had solved the problem, but as I reached the threshold, I heard a sound that didn't belong in a storage room, a soft, wet intake of breath. It wasn't the sound of a ghost or a spirit. It was the unmistakable sound of a living human being trying very hard to remain quiet in the dark. I froze, my back to the room, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I slowly panned my flashlight back toward the bed, my light shaking so violently that the shadows on the wall seemed to dance and stretch. I didn't see anything at first, just the same piles of boxes and the same empty bed, until the light caught a pair of eyes reflecting from the narrow gap between the bottom of the bed frame and the floor. There was someone under there, a person curled into a tight, impossible ball, their skin the color of wet parchment and their clothes tattered and caked in decades of filth. This wasn't a spirit of the dead. This was a man, very much alive, who had clearly been living in the crawl spaces and wall cavities of this hospital for a long, long time. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with an intensity that suggested he had been watching me from the shadows of that wing for every single one of my shifts. I realized then that the call button hadn't been a glitch or a haunting. It had been a lure, a way to get someone to open the door and provide a moment of distraction. My gaze drifted to the side of the bed where his hand was visible, and I saw that he was holding a surgical scalpel, the blade polished to a mirror shine despite the grime on his fingers. I didn't scream, because I knew that the sound wouldn't reach the main station through the heavy fire doors I had closed behind me. I backed out of the room slowly, never taking my light off those unblinking eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The man didn't chase me immediately. He just watched me, his chest rising and falling in that same slow, wet rhythm I had heard before. I managed to pull the door shut and lock it, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys, and I ran back toward the light of the main ward as fast as my legs would carry me. I called security, my voice cracking as I tried to explain that there was an intruder in the 400 wing, someone who looked like they had been part of the building itself. By the time the guards arrived and we unlocked the door to 402 again, the room was empty, the boxes were undisturbed, and the only sign that anyone had been there was the call button, once again depressed and glowing amber. We searched the entire wing, looking for access panels or hidden doors, but the maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth that no one had mapped in years. The security team told me I was probably just overworked, that the shadows in the old wing can play tricks on the mind of someone who's had too much coffee and too little sleep. They laughed it off, but I noticed that even they didn't want to linger in the hallway for too long, and they made sure to double bolt the door before we left. I went back to my station, but I couldn't sit down, couldn't stop the feeling that I was being watched from every vent and every darkened corner of the ceiling. About an hour before my shift ended, I sat down at the computer to finish my charting, trying to keep my mind focused on dosages and vitals. That's when I noticed a small, damp smudge on the corner of my desk, right next to my coffee cup, a smudge that looked exactly like a fingerprint made of gray, subterranean dust. I looked up at the air vent directly above my head and saw that the metal slats were slightly bent, as if someone had recently pried them open from the inside. I didn't call security again because I knew they wouldn't find him. He knew the guts of this hospital better than anyone alive, and he knew how to move through the walls like a shadow. I finished my shift in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every chime of a call bell and every distant thud of a closing door. When the morning sun finally began to bleed through the windows, I didn't feel relieved. I felt exposed, like a target that had been marked and studied. I walked to my car in the parking garage, my eyes darting to every van and every concrete pillar, my keys clutched between my knuckles like a weapon. I drove home in a daze, but when I walked through my front door and reached for the light switch, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the small table in my entryway where I usually keep my mail, was a single, rusted call button remote, its cord severed with a clean, surgical cut. I haven't gone back to work since that night, and I've moved to a different city, but sometimes, when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear a soft, wet intake of breath coming from the attic. I don't check the attic anymore, and I never stay in the dark for longer than I have to, because I know he's still out there, navigating the hidden spaces. The hospital eventually renovated the 400 wing, turning it into a modern outpatient center with bright lights and new wiring. But I know the bones of that building are still the same. I often wonder how many other night nurses see those amber lights and think they're just glitches in an old system. They don't realize that sometimes the person pushing the button isn't looking for help. They're just letting you know that they've finally found a way in. My phone screen lit up just a few minutes ago with an unknown number, and when I answered, there was no voice on the other end. Just the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of a plastic button being pressed over and over again. I haven't slept in 3 days, and every time the wind rattles the window panes, I find myself looking for the reflection of eyes in the dark. There is no resolution to this. No police report that can capture the feeling of being hunted by someone who exists in the margins of reality. I am just waiting for the next light to turn on, for the next chime to echo through the silence of my own home. The boundaries of my safety have been completely eroded, replaced by the persistent, dull glow of a threat that doesn't need to hide anymore. I can smell the dust and the stagnant air even now, drifting through the vents of my apartment like a lingering curse. He is patient, I know that now, and he has all the time in the world to wait for me to turn my back one last time. There are no ghosts at St. Jude's, only the things we leave behind in the walls, and the people who decide to stay there with them. I just wish I had never looked under that bed, because now that I've seen him, he knows that I can never truly escape the 400 wing. The call light is blinking in my mind now, an amber square that will never go out, no matter how many times I try to reset it. The graveyard shift at St. Jude's Memorial isn't the cinematic thrill ride people think it is, but rather a grueling exercise in resisting the urge to faceplant into a desk covered in lukewarm coffee rings and crumpled candy wrappers. Most nights, the only thing I have to worry about is a stray cat triggering the loading dock sensors, or the occasional confused patient wandering out of the geriatric ward in search of a bathroom that hasn't existed since the 1994 renovation. The air in the security hub is always thick with the smell of ozone and the low-frequency hum of 16 cathode ray tube monitors that haven't been updated since the hospital was built. My job is essentially to be a professional observer of nothingness, watching the grainy, black and white feeds of empty corridors and sterile waiting rooms until the sun finally starts to bleed through the smoggy city skyline. Tonight started out exactly like every other Tuesday, with the same flickering fluorescent bulb in hallway B4, and the same stack of paperwork documenting that absolutely nothing of note had occurred during the previous 8 hours. I remember checking my watch at exactly 2:14 a.m., feeling that familiar wave of heavy-lidded exhaustion, and wondering if I could sneak away to the break room for a third pot of the sludge they call coffee. I leaned back in my squeaky plastic chair, the linoleum floor cold beneath my boots, and let my eyes drift across the wall of monitors one more time. That was when I noticed something slightly off on the feed for the East Wing's secondary recovery ward, a place that had been decommissioned for months due to a plumbing issue. The ward is basically one long, narrow hallway lined with empty patient bays, each separated by those heavy, mustard yellow privacy curtains that always seem to hold the smell of antiseptic and old sickness. On camera 12, I saw the very last curtain at the far end of the hall twitch, just a tiny rhythmic flutter like a breeze was passing through an open window. I frowned, knowing for a fact that the East Wing is a hermetically sealed environment with no central air and windows that have been bolted shut for 20 years. I figured it was probably just a draft from the elevator shaft, or maybe a rat scurrying behind the fabric. So I adjusted the brightness on the monitor and leaned in closer. Then, with a slow, deliberate smoothness that made the hair on my arm stand up, the curtain was drawn shut, as if a hand had gripped the edge and pulled it firmly across the track. There was no one on the screen, no shadow, no hint of a human figure standing behind the fabric, just the metal ring sliding with a faint, metallic rasp I could almost hear through the glass. I blinked, rubbing my eyes and telling myself that the flickering 15 frame per second refresh rate was just playing tricks on my tired brain. But then the second-to-last curtain started to move, sliding shut with the same hauntingly steady pace, concealing the empty bed behind it. My heart gave a sharp, uncomfortable thud against my ribs as I watched the third curtain follow suit. Then the fourth, a synchronized progression of yellow fabric closing off the ward piece by piece. It looked like someone was walking down the hall at a brisk pace, systematically closing every single bay, yet the space between the curtains remained frustratingly, impossibly empty. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, the kind that makes your skin feel like it's being crawled over by 1,000 tiny insects. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling with the plastic casing, but I hesitated because I didn't want to sound like a lunatic reporting a ghost to the head of nursing. I told myself it had to be a prank, maybe one of the orderlies playing a trick on the new guy, using a thin fishing line or some other mechanical explanation. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and decided I had to go down there and see it for myself because the alternative, that I was losing my mind, was much worse. The walk from the security hub to the East Wing felt 10 times longer than usual, the shadows in the hallways seeming to stretch and warp under the sickly yellow glow of the emergency lights. Every footstep I took echoed off the polished floors, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was following me just a few paces behind, stopping whenever I stopped. I reached the heavy double doors of the recovery ward, my hand trembling slightly as I pushed them open, the smell of dust and stale air hitting me like a physical weight. The hallway was exactly as it appeared on the monitor, a long stretch of silence bathed in the dim, blue light of the exit signs. I looked down the line of patient bays and saw that every single curtain was indeed drawn shut, creating a series of small, private cocoons of shadow. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over the yellow fabric, and for a second, I thought I saw the silhouette of a person standing behind the third curtain. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, the silence of the hospital suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating like a wet wool blanket. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and wavering in the vast, empty space, but there was no response, only the distant hum of the building's plumbing. I approached the third curtain, my hand reaching out to pull it back, my mind racing through every possible logical explanation for what I was seeing. I gripped the fabric and yanked it open, bracing myself for a jump scare or a laughing coworker. But there was nothing there but an empty, stripped mattress and a rusted Roman IV stand. I let out a shaky breath, a nervous laugh bubbling up in my chest, and turned around to head back to the safety of my monitors and my lukewarm coffee. That was when I heard it, the distinct, sharp clack of a curtain ring sliding across a metal rod directly behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly searching the dark, and saw that the curtain I had just opened was now pulled shut again. Then the one next to it closed. Then the one next to that. They were closing faster now, a rapid-fire succession of movement that felt aggressive, like the hallway was being sealed off by an invisible force that was getting closer to me with every second. I backed away, my heels catching on the uneven linoleum, my pulse thudding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the sound of my own panicked breathing. I realized then that the movement wasn't supernatural. It was too precise, too calculated, and there was a subtle weight to the fabric that suggested someone was actually grabbing it. I saw a pair of boots, heavy and caked in dried mud, peeking out from beneath the hem of a curtain just a few feet away from where I stood. They weren't invisible. They were just experts at being overlooked, a human threat that had been living in the bowels of the hospital for God knows how long. I was trapped in the long, dark corridor with someone who knew every inch of the shadows, someone who had been watching me watch them on the monitors. I felt a hand, solid, cold, and very much human, grab my shoulder from behind the nearest curtain, the grip like a vice. I screamed and swung my heavy metal flashlight, connecting with something soft, hearing a grunt of pain that confirmed my worst fears. This was a person, and they were angry. I scrambled away, my flashlight rolling across the floor and illuminating the feet of several more people emerging from behind the curtains. One of them held a rusted scalpel, the metal glinting in the stray beam of light, his face twisted into a mask of pure, silent malice. I realized that the East Wing wasn't empty. It was a hive, a hidden colony of the forgotten and the broken who had made this place their own. The last thing I saw before the flashlight battery flickered and died was the man with the scalpel stepping into the light, his smile devoid of any human warmth. The darkness that followed was absolute, filled only with the sound of several dozen curtains being drawn shut all at once, sealing the hallway into a series of private, silent rooms. I reached for my radio one last time, clicking the button and whispering for help, but the only response was the steady, rhythmic static of a dead frequency. I could hear them breathing now, a chorus of shallow, jagged inhalations coming from every direction, closing the distance between us in the pitch black. My fingers brushed against the cold fabric of a curtain that shouldn't have been there, and I realized they had moved me, or moved the world around me, while I was blinded. There is no sound of footsteps anymore, just the soft swish of fabric and the feeling of a cold, sharp edge pressing against the back of my neck. I'm still sitting here in the dark, writing this on my phone's notepad with the brightness turned all the way down, hoping someone finds the device after they are done with me. The curtains are all closed now, and I can't even tell where the doors are, or if the hallway even exists anymore outside of this yellow fabric maze. I can feel the breath of someone standing right behind me, smelling of copper and old earth, waiting for me to turn around. My battery is at 3%, and the screen is starting to dim, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the metal rings sliding one last time. They aren't going to let me leave, and the worst part is knowing that on the monitor back in the hub, the screen just shows an empty, quiet hallway. I can hear the man whispering something now, a low, guttural string of words I can't quite make out, but the tone is unmistakable. He's telling me it's time to go to sleep, and as the light on my phone finally dies, I feel the curtain wrap around my face like a shroud. The silence of the hospital is total now, a heavy, suffocating weight that swallows my last frantic heartbeat whole. I am just another secret hidden behind the mustard yellow fabric of Ward 4C, a place that officially doesn't exist. There will be no record of me in the morning, only an empty chair and a cold cup of coffee at the security desk. The monitors will continue to hum, the static will continue to flicker, and the curtains will remain perfectly, terrifyingly still.